Brilliant. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this afternoon for our presentation around relationships, sex and health education here at Pinner Park, and with a special emphasis on what will be taught in year 3. We're going to just cover a little bit of housekeeping about questions and things, and then we'll get really stuck into the legal position around relationships, sex education, what we teach here at Pinner Park and when. Can have a look at some of the resources we use. And we're also going to have an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you want, and we'll make sure that we're not recording at that point, so you can ask questions quite freely. If you have any questions, do feel free to write them in the chat, and we'll make sure we cover those at the end, or at the end we can just ask them on microphone. And whenever we talk about PSHE in school, and we do lessons every term around the personal, social and health education, we always encourage these codes of conduct. Of course, ready, respectful, safe and kind is important to us in every aspect of our school life. But we've got these other 2 aspects as well that we sometimes talk about with the children when we're talking about things which are personal to us or things which are important, talking about respect, openness, confidentiality and kindness. And then some practical ways that we can do that, like taking turns to speak and using positive words, respecting each other's privacy and confidentiality. And we'll obviously apply that to this meeting too. So we'll be kind and respectful to one another, and we'll also respect each other's confidentiality, especially if we are raising questions at the end. I think at this point, I mean, you may have been a part of one of these presentations last year, but I think it's really helpful for us as parents and adults to think about how and when we learned about relationships and sex. Just have a think about that. I won't be asking anyone to share this information, but just have a think. Think about whether there's anything that you didn't understand or anything you were worried about. Perhaps for some of you, you didn't have that experience at school of learning about sex and relationships. Perhaps for some it was at secondary school, or for some it might have been at primary school. And one of the important things for us to remember is when we're reflecting on our own experience is how much the world has changed. Now, I don't know how old you are. I'm perhaps a little bit older than some of you, but since I was at school, many things have changed. And of course, the internet is probably the biggest aspect of that. Our children are growing up in a world where their mind isn't necessarily empty about relationships and sex, and health, and all of those things, because they've got all these different bits of media which are competing for their attention, whether it's the internet or television or social media. All of those different things will be giving children information about relationships all of the time. And I think it's important that as adults that we recognize that is out there. It's one of those things, we can't put it back in the box. We can't get rid of the internet. We're not going to get rid of social media or pop songs, but we do have to understand the context that the children are growing up in. It's quite a different context to perhaps the one that you may have grown up in, and certainly different to the one that I grew up in. So it's an important aspect of how we teach relationships and health education to the children, because we're operating within a real world situation with all its contradictions, and children's heads may already be filled with some information about relationships and sex gathered from those different sources. Some of those will be truthful things, some of them myths and half-truths. And it's important that we don't let our adult knowledge of relationships and sex prevent us from seeing it from a children's point of view, from the point of view as a 7- and 8-year-old, for instance, in year 3. And our focus as parents and as a school is always on building healthy attitudes, positive relationships. We're not just worried about threats. We don't see the internet as a threat. We see it as a very positive aspect of our teaching and learning, but we do recognize that there are contradictions there, and we want to make sure we give a very positive view about health and sex and relationships. So when we're thinking about how we teach relationships, sex, health and education here at Pinner Park, We might consider these different approaches. Have a look at those pictures. They all represent a different approach. That first one represents keeping children in the dark. And sometimes our first response as parents, I have two girls, they grew up through school, they're just adults now. Our first sense as a parent might be to not want children to know anything about relationships or sex or health education in this way, and to keep them in the dark. The second one represents being overwhelmed, information overload, telling children more than they need to know and causing confusion. The last image represents what we might call scare tactics. Sometimes it can be tempting as a parent or as a school to say, well, actually, let's really worry them about things, and then they won't want to go there. But actually, all the research would suggest that that dripping tap approach is the most appropriate way to do things. Keeping children in the dark, all the research would point towards, for example, that children who don't know enough about sex and relationships in a positive and healthy way are more likely to have sex younger, they're more likely to be abused, they're more likely to have a teenage pregnancy. All of those things can be prevented through a really clever and appropriate sex education program in school. And we try and use that dripping tap approach. And you'll know that if your children have been at Pinner Park since they started here at school, you'll know they've already started that drip feeding from nursery all the way through to where they are at year 3 right now. Age and stage appropriate, little bits of information, building on what they've learned before, so that when they get to hear about some of the more things to do with sexual intercourse, for instance, later on in the school, they're prepared and ready, and also prepared and ready for their secondary education, where sex education is compulsory. So here's our aim as a school, is to get accurate information at the right age and stage of development, coming from school and home, working in partnership. It's really important, and part of the reason why we do these meetings, that we're open and transparent about what we're teaching, because we would fully expect parents to follow this up at home. One of the interesting things for parents, and certainly this was the case for me with my children, is that I was pleased that the school were introducing certain topics, because it gave me an opportunity to speak to our girls about some of the things they were learning. That can be an awkward thing to talk about at home, can't it? So actually having the information from school about what is being taught gives you an opportunity to speak to your children. And we know that parents will want to ensure that their children are getting the right message. And of course, families will come from different points of view, different values, cultural and religious beliefs, and you will want to make sure that you speak to the children about relationships in the context of your family values. We just think if parents know what's taught in the school, it makes your job a lot easier, and that's why we're here this evening. So a bit of background about relationships, sex and health education. There is a compulsoriness to relationships and health education in schools, and in secondary schools, sex education is compulsory. For primary schools, obviously we have to teach the science curriculum, and we have to teach relationships and health education. That includes is changing adolescent bodies. And there's a strong recommendation that all schools have a sex education program, and that's what we have. The guidance tells us that children should know what a positive, healthy, caring, safe relationship looks and feels like, how to speak up when things don't feel that way, and how to make and maintain positive relationships. And of course, we talk about online and offline relationships here in school. That's part of the difference between when I was at school and when your children are. And in health education, we cover all of these different things, and that's a compulsory part of the curriculum. It's interesting to note that lessons about puberty, the changing body, have been included as part of the statutory curriculum at primary level. So it's not considered to be part of sex education, it's considered to be part of health education and science. And for sex education, the Department for Education recommends that all primary schools have a sex education programme based on the age and stage of the children and drawing on the science curriculum the children will be taught in any case. And here's some of the science the children will be taught in school anyway. It's part of the science curriculum. So Key Stage 1, this is what your children have already been through in year 1 and 2, talking about parts of the human body, talking about how parts of the body are used, how they're associated with sense, and talking about animals, including humans, how they have offspring and grow into adults. So in year 1 and 2, often we'll talk about babies and babies growing up, talk about young animals and older animals, talk about all different life cycles as part of that Key Stage 1 curriculum. At Key Stage 2, go into just a little bit more detail about that, do talk about reproduction in some animals and plants, and describe the changes as humans develop into old age. And of course, learning about puberty is part of that. We use a scheme of work or a resource called Jigsaw, and it helps us to order all of our PSHE, our personal social health education, through the whole school year. This isn't something we just do when we're talking about relationships education, we do it throughout the school year. We work through these 6 different units of work. So being me in my world is what happens right back in September, that first half term, all the way through to changing me, which is the last unit of work we do in the second half of the summer term. And then these golden threads throughout all of those, which talk about relationships and values, mental health and self-esteem, social skills, and of course, safeguarding. And your children will have been doing this ever since they've been at Pinner Park, working through those 6 units. Each year, we revisit those units and each time take a slightly different and more grown-up approach to each of those units. And of course, as a rights respecting school, we always try and make those links to the articles within the rights respecting framework. And on the screen there, you can see some of the links that we've made. So let's just go into some of the details about these 2 summer term units, because that's where much of the relationships and health education and some of what we would be calling sex education are included. Now, this is for the whole of the primary school, so don't panic if you see some words on there that make you think, oh, that wouldn't be right for a year 3 child. We would agree, and this is the whole of the framework. So under relationships, we talk about all sorts of aspects of families and friendships, going through to how to stay safe, talking about memories, talking about grief, all things to do with relationships across from nursery all the way through to year 6. And in the second half of this summer term, each class and every year group, we're looking at the Changing Me unit. And that's where we start to look at things like life cycles and how babies are made, changes in bodies, but also talking about assertiveness and self-respect, talking about how we accept change. And of course, because it happens at the end of the school year, we're also talking about looking ahead. So year 6, we'll talk about moving schools. In other classes, we'll talk about moving classes or moving up a year group, helping the children to prepare for those changes in life as they grow up. And I thought we'd just give a bit more information about puberty and human reproduction in our scheme, because that's often something that parents can be concerned about. So this is all on our website, so you can have a look through. Usually it's about 2 or 3 lessons in each year group. So it doesn't dominate the scheme of learning. All those other aspects are there throughout the year. And you can see there that already the children will have talked about growing up and how we've changed since we were babies in early years. Talked a bit more about changing bodies and changing me in year 1 and year 2, differences between boys and girls, learning those names for different body parts. That's all part of the curriculum that children have already studied. In year 3, we talk a little bit about outside body changes and inside body changes, and I'll come on to more detail about that in a moment. Then as the children go through into year 4, 5, and 6, there's more information about puberty, some specific areas that affect boys and girls differently, having a baby, and of course, conception is covered as part of our scheme as well. So that's where the children are heading, but it's not where they are now. So what's taught in year three? Well, first of all, let's remind ourselves that we always teach about pants and how to stay safe in our school. And we use the NSPCC Speak Out, Stay Safe materials too. So all the work the children have done in nursery all the way through to year two about talking pants and the Pantosaurus on the song, we continue with those themes. So children in our school are already used to talking about the proper names for parts of the body, for instance, and talking openly about bodies. Before half term, we cover some lessons around relationships, and on there you can see some of the areas that we cover. I won't read them all out, but you can see they're quite general themes of friendship and families. It talks about expectations for males and females, and particularly taking away stereotypes, understanding about rights and how to express appreciation. So some really lovely lessons there about what it means to have a positive and healthy relationship. And that's covered before half term, generally speaking. It's slightly shorter half term before, so it might just go over to next half term. Then the second part of the term, you do the Changing Me unit. And I'm just going to go through each of these and then give you a bit more detail afterwards, because I think it's important you understand as parents what we're going to be telling the children so you can follow this at home. So the first area is around how animals and humans change quite a bit between conception and growing up. And it's usually the female who has the baby. So there's all that information there about growing up, about how bodies change, before they're born and how bodies change after they're born. We'll talk a bit more detail about how babies grow and develop in the mother's uterus, and understand what babies need to live and grow. And then understanding that boys and girls' bodies need to change as they grow up. And one of the reasons for this is that they can have babies or make babies. And understanding the changes that happen on the outside and the inside is one of those lessons that we talk about. We talk a little bit about stereotypical ideas, particularly around the roles of men and women. And that's always interesting, talking to the children about that, about, who's responsible for feeding children, who's responsible for looking after children and so on, and making sure that we make it clear that, all members of the family can contribute to those roles. And then finally, because it's the last unit of work that we do this year, we'll talk about what we're looking forward to about moving to our next class and into our next year group. Here's some of the vocabulary that we use in year three. Now, much of this will already have been introduced in nursery reception year one and year two. So the children won't be new to this. As a school, we always try and use the anatomical names for parts of the body, whilst recognizing and we don't disagree that families will often have their own names for parts of the body. But it's really important that we have a shared language. It would be difficult for us to know all the different names that different families use for different parts of the body. And it's really important that children do know those scientific names for parts of the body too, so that we have that shared language. It helps to keep them safe because they can talk about parts of their body quite openly, and it just debunks anything being something that should be kept a secret, or anything that should be kept, shouldn't be talked about. And we don't agree with that. We think actually it's quite okay to use these scientific vocabulary for different parts of the body. And children will be used to that because they'll have been doing that since they were in reception in our school. I'm going to show you just some of the sort of PowerPoint slides that will be used. This isn't all of them. In fact, I've tried to put in some of the ones that might be more graphic, if you like. There's plenty. The first lesson, it's all about how animals grow up. So there'll be pictures of kittens and cats and foals and horses and so on. So there's lots of those sorts of materials as well. But for some of the lessons, we do show children some images which show how bodies change as children grow up. You can see there some images of some boys into men and girls into women. You'll see there an image of a baby growing inside a mother's uterus, and that is part of a much larger slide with all the different stages as the baby grows. And when we talk about inside changes, we do show these images and talk them through, and this is all part of a lesson. It's not just shown on the screen, where we talk about the different things that happen inside a body so that men and women are getting ready to be able to have babies and how to make a baby. We also do talk about how a sperm and an egg are needed to create a baby, in the same way as we talk about reproduction within the animal kingdom and within flowers and so on. Um, Dealing with questions is really important. We do encourage the children to ask questions in every aspect of our teaching and learning here at Binnerbark. And for this, we have question boxes in the class. I mean, children are very welcome to ask questions whenever they want to in class. But in this particular area of work, sometimes children might be a bit embarrassed about asking a question, or might be worried about something, or not quite understand the language they need to use. So we have a question box where children just write down a question and put it in. And regularly the teachers will check that box and will respond to the questions in class. It's a really good way of the teacher having a bit of time to prepare the answers to those questions, for children to be able to ask questions anonymously, and also for us to filter the questions according to whether they're appropriate for that year group. We will never answer a question which goes beyond what is expected to be taught in year 3 or year 2 or year 1 or early years. If it is a question that relates to something that will be taught in year 4 or year 5 or year 6, we just won't answer that question, or we'll say that that's another special part of the learning, and we'll be learning about that in years 4, 5 or 6. Or we might even refer them back to their parents and say, you know, you might want to ask your parents about that, and they might want to tell you the answer to that question or have a talk with you about it. We've done a special leaflet about LGBT plus equality, because I know there's lots of misinformation out there about this particular aspect of teaching, and particularly now. Um, it's just to say that, you know, we comply with the requirements of the Equality Act. You know, we make it clear that when we're talking about different representations of family, you know, even back in reception in year 1, when we use images, we try and use a mixture of images. We want everyone to feel included in the teaching. We don't want anyone to be worried about it. You know, children who come from a single parent family, or from a multi-generational family, or from a family where there might be 2 mums or 2 dads, we want them to feel included in the teaching. So we'll try and use those representations. We don't do any specific teaching about LGBT plus issues with respect to sex education, but obviously when we're talking about relationships, we do include different types of relationships within our teaching. If you're concerned about that area, do have a look at the specific leaflet that's on our website, which talks about how we teach about LGBT plus issues within our school. And if you've got any further questions, just do come and ask. We'd be very happy to answer them. Sometimes we get asked about whether children can be withdrawn from sex education. There's some very specific law around this. The law has changed recently. I talked about the compulsory nature of relationships and health education. So all aspects of around puberty and growing up and relationships and health are part of the statutory curriculum at primary school. So children have to be included in those lessons, and we would expect everyone to be there. When we get on later in the school and talk about human reproduction and conception and birth, so when we talk about sexual intercourse, for instance, or when we talk about giving birth, then we do allow parents to withdraw children from those specific lessons if they request it. We would encourage parents not to, because we really do want children to have accurate information on human reproduction before they go to secondary school, because we'd much rather they heard it from us and from their parents than from elsewhere, where they might pick up myths and untruths. The curriculum in year 3 is all included as part of the relationships or health education. So all the children will be included in all the lessons in year 3. On our website and included in the newsletter last week, there are links to these 4 key documents. One is our policy on personal social health education and relationship, sex and health education. There's also a leaflet, which is just a sort of an easier read version of that policy for parents. And there's one for PSHE and one for RSHE. There's also a specific leaflet about LGBT+. We only do that because parents have often asked that in the past, and we thought it'd be great to have a leaflet available to parents. Right, that was a little bit of a race through the information. We're going to sort of come to the end of the briefing part of that. Could I just say to you that if you want some further information about the detail of what is taught in each year group, do have a look on our website and have a look at those documents. If you're still unsure, if you want more detail, do speak to your child's class teacher or send an email into the school office, and we will very happily answer those questions for you. I'm going to open the floor now to questions, but just before I do, if you're watching this on catch up, then thank you very much for watching the video. We're going to stop the video recording now. If you've got any questions, please do pop in and see us or ask through the office, and we'll be very happy to answer your questions. Or if you want to see any of the materials that we use when we're teaching this subject, then do let us know. But I'm just going to stop the video now. So if you're watching on catch up, thank you for watching.